Hi, this is the Mind Report. I'm Paul Bloom. I'm a professor of psychology and cognitive science at Yale University, and I'm talking to my good friend David Pizarro at Cornell University. Hello, David. I'll leave you to introduce yourself.
Hi, Paul. My name is David Pizarro. I'm also a professor of psychology at Cornell University, and I'm currently in Toronto for the year.
Great. So we're going to talk about disgust and emotions and rationality and reason and psychology. I thought one place to begin would be David just had released a wonderful TED Talk that was about the topics of disgust and how disgust relates to morality and politics. And this is an issue near and dear to both of our hearts, an issue which has caused a lot of controversy. And I thought we'd start off, David, you could just tell us about the talk.
Yeah, sure. And I should say that the first I got interested in disgust was in a seminar that you gave. So Paul introduced me to all things gross.
Thank you. That's lovely.
Yeah. There's the inadvertent part and then the content part. So I was lucky to give this TED Talk, and essentially reviewing evidence both from our work and from the work of others that disgust, an emotion that I think most people would agree, at least anybody who has any interest in the topic, evolves to keep us from putting bad things in our mouth. This reaction, a natural aversion to all things that might be contaminating, actually has sort of profound influences on our judgment. The notion that emotions influence judgment is, it's fairly obvious to most people. I think in the case of disgust, what's not obvious is that this basic emotion that you feel when you walk into a dirty bathroom, for instance, or when somebody gives you food that smells really bad or is rotten, that this would actually influence what you believe in the moral or political domain is interesting. So I'll give it just a brief history of how we started doing this work. We had become, actually, Paul, you and I had become interested in the relationship between Building on Work by Paul Rozin and Jonathan Haidt on this relationship between disgust and morality. So there's the science story, and then there's just the story about how it actually occurred. We started collecting data on disgust sensitivity. So disgust sensitivity is basically, even though these emotions are universal, so everybody, no matter where you look across the world, has some kind of disgust reaction, at least once they reach a certain age, just like they all have joy and surprise and anger and fear. There are individual differences. So some people are just more squeamish than other people. And it turns out I'm actually pretty squeamish. Have we talked about this, Paul? Are you easily disgusted?
I am extremely easily disgusted.
Yeah.
I can barely stand to read the items on the disgust scale. So there's one like you have to pick up a dead cat with your hands.
Right.
And some people say, whatever, that's fine. I'm in the category of people who say, just kill me. Just blow my brains out. I don't have to do that. There's one item on the disgust scale that always cracks me up because it's you sit on a bus seat and it's slightly warm from the last person who's been there, and I am totally unbothered by that. I actually think it's positive in the winter.
It's so interesting. There was just when I'm not doing all of the work that I do, I was browsing Reddit on the internet, which is and there was an entire thread devoted to this topic. Whether or not, and the population was split. So some people found it just completely gross to sit down and feel the warmth of the previous person, and some people thought that it was kind of cool. At least you don't have to warm it up yourself. And I'm of the former variety. So I am also very easily disgusted, and this thought of sitting on a warm seat. Those toilet seats that are soft.
Yeah, you find that.
That really gross. So we wanted to find this link between general. The thought was, okay, maybe if disgust is really working in shaping moral beliefs, it should work more for those people who are easily disgusted, for those who are squeamish. And Paul Rosen and John Haidt had already developed a scale of disgust sensitivity, which is one scale that's probably the most commonly used, that asks people on a variety of items, like the ones Paul just mentioned, how disgusted they would be. And you can compute this score and calculate a general average and sort the population into people who are very, very easily disgusted or people who are not disgusted at all. And it turns out your score on the scale actually predicts actual behavior. Sometimes we're suspicious of self-report, as we should be, but these authors demonstrated nicely that your score on the scale predicts whether you're willing to do things like bring you into the lab, and are you willing to eat chocolate that's been baked to look like dog poo. And it turns out your score on the scale predicts it. So we developed a set of moral items and tossed in the disgust sensitivity questionnaire. This was when I was doing a postdoc with a professor named Peter Ditto at UC Irvine, and he said, why don't you toss in some political items just because he was interested in politics.
Yeah.
And so for about 3 data collections, I kept getting this relationship that it wasn't working with any of the moral items that we had selected, but people who were more easily disgusted were more likely to report that they were politically conservative. And I ignored that finding. I think I found it 3 times in UC Irvine, and I ignored it. And then when I got to Cornell my first year, Yoel Imbar, who's collaborated, who's really done all of the work, said, you got to pick this up. So we replicated it at Cornell. We replicated it in a larger internet sample, and we kept finding the same thing no matter where we looked. And the effect size was about the same. I mean, so this was, if you measure just the correlation, the relationship between your score on disgust sensitivity and your score on either 1 item or 3 items, or asking you your political orientation on a scale of 1 to 7, are you very conservative or very liberal? The more easily disgusted you said you were, also the more politically conservative you said you were. And it turns out that it wrapped back around to the moral domain, because when we looked at what features of political conservatism people were focused on, or that were driving this relationship, it was things like gay marriage and abortion, those things that we might call socio-moral, or the sort of family values aspect of especially American conservatism. And so we published a few papers. Yeah.
So just a couple thoughts. One are questions. One thing is, do you have a sense off the cuff roughly how big the correlation is? Because even if it's small, it's intellectually interesting that these 2 things are connected. But in the real world, how much can you predict of somebody's political or moral orientation by knowing how easily disgusted they are?
Right. It's the sort of yes, we do. And so no matter where we look, and now we've conducted we've actually looked at these data in many countries as well. And the correlation is between 0.2 and 0.3. I think the highest we ever get is 0.32 or something like that. So
not tiny, in between, middling.
It's the kind of relationship that makes psychologists excited, but the kind of relationship that if you were interested, if you were actually a political candidate and you wanted to know what political orientation people were, asking them disgust items is going to give you, like 10% of the variance.
Yeah.
So
it's intellectually interesting from a sort of theory of how emotions relate to morality. It needs to be explained. It's what some theories predict. But it's not as if, and we'll get to this later, but it's not as if we've shown that people's politics and morality reduce to their emotional reactions.
Right. Yeah. And so,
you did these correlational things.
Yeah, and then we also showed that how easily disgusted you were predicted your implicit attitudes toward homosexuality, your attitudes toward gay marriage, explicitly your attitudes towards gay men, on a feeling thermometer, which is just a scale of how warmly or coldly you feel toward social groups. And then we also did, because the strategy can't just stop at correlations. We wanted to know whether actually bringing people into the lab and making them disgusted would have an effect on their judgments. And we showed that a foul odor, this is, by the way, the last 3 papers I've talked about have all been with Paul, so you're being very patient in listening to this. But bringing people into the lab, and on days in which we made the lab smell really bad, actually made them more homophobic or more anti-gay. So we showed that the correlation between these political and moral attitudes, and we can show, and others have shown, a causal link that actually making people disgusted, independent of political orientation, makes them more harsh toward particular outgroups.
So why would this be? So why would the disgust bone be connected to morality bone? Because, on the face of it, it's a nice puzzle, because disgust, as you point out, plausibly evolved as a response to bad foods or poisons or diseases. And so why would it extend to our reactions about politics or morality?
Yeah, I think that's the question, the key question here. So there are a couple of possibilities. When you look at the disgust literature and you look at how disgust affects judgment, you find that it tends to affect moral judgment in particular. So this link there are at least 3 explanations that I can think of. One is that disgust is a negative emotion, and it's a strong negative emotion. So one of the reasons I actually was drawn to studying disgust is when you bring people into the lab, it's kind of hard to make them feel too sad or too angry or too afraid. But it's really easy to make them feel disgust and feel it pretty strongly.
You have this great clip in your TED video when you're talking to Richard Dawkins, and you managed to successfully gross him out to a point where you said in the TED Talk that you felt he was going to vomit all over you.
He actually, I asked him after, so this was and I think it's up on YouTube. He has this very nice new documentary called Sex, Death, and the Meaning of Life.
Yeah.
And so I chatted with him for 10 minutes on or something like on the actual documentary, but 3 hours in real life. And the producers had asked me to bring a variety of things to discuss him. And so one of the things I bought was a jar of these little shrimp that are used to flavor foods that you can get at an Asian food store.
Yeah.
And they smell just really, that it's like brine. It doesn't smell good. And so we had to do 3 takes because there was only one camera and we needed different angles. And every single time he gagged. And so at the end I said, Richard, because I call him Richard, were you just playing it up for the documentary? And he says, no, not at all. Was actually, of all the disgust elicitors, that one was the one that brought him closest to vomiting.
Well, the British are very disgust sensitive.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, the Darwin quote that I use in the talk is one that I got from you. When it was nice to pair Darwin's squeamishness, when he talks about a naked savage hand touching his meat.
There's another Darwin quote. It might be from The Descent of Man, but it's something to the effect of that he's talking about disgust reactions to food, and he says that a new food, a new sort of meat, the idea of disgust, the idea of eating it would disgust us, which makes sense. But then he says that even the thought of it might make one retch or vomit. Yeah. And I realized it maybe in that Victorian era, people were, hypersensitive to these sort of aversive emotions.
Yeah, these were the times when people used to faint all the time.
Yeah,
when they were...
those were the days.
When it was socially acceptable to...
People had a proper range of emotions, sort of inappropriate.
So, yeah, and it actually points to something really interesting about disgust, which is that the associative nature of it. So one of the things I talk about when I talk to my students that marks disgust from the other emotions is, if you, Paul, stand next to a spider, you don't become scary to me. Or you stand next to a tiger, you don't become scary. But you touch something dirty, you become dirty. And so in some ways, before we had a proper germ theory of disease, disgust was already tracking things by contact in a way that's consistent with the way disease is transmitted. So and it's very powerful, and it makes sense that that we want to retch when we even think about some nasty food. It's just a particularly powerful emotion. And so, okay, so it's a particularly powerful negative emotion. So it could be that just the way negative emotions work is they just make you harsher judges of everything, right? You just become negative. I think there's good evidence showing now that that can't account for all of these findings. So when people actually bother to manipulate various negative emotions, and when they bother to ask you questions in both the moral and non-moral domain, disgust has a special relationship with morality. So inducing disgust makes people especially harsh in their moral judgments, and especially harsh about a particular set of moral judgments. So even a subset in the moral domain that we can talk about in a bit, but things to do with outgroups that are seen as potentially dirty, and sexual behaviors. Those are the ones that are especially pumped by disgust. So another possible theory is that there's this metaphor. This comes from a lot of the literature on embodiment within social psychology, and I'm sure it's spread to other areas. So the argument here is that we just have a tight link between bad and dirty, and so it's the metaphor has just sort of one of the ways in which we determine what is bad is we use cues to dirtiness, and that this is just such a tight link. We have such a tight link between the two concepts that sort of priming one, in this case, would be by disgusting somebody, would actually make them find that thing to be more morally wrong. I don't think that this is the right account, and I'll say why in a second when I talk about the third possible candidate. The third that I can think of, the third explanation is that disgust is part of this just an avoidance system that evolved to keep us away from contaminants. And it's a motivational system, and it's a very efficient one. And so any cue that an act or an individual or a group of people might potentially contaminate gets those motivational juices flowing. You avoid it, you think it's bad. And so this is why disgust in particular cues up judgments about these certain kinds of outgroups that seem different from us, especially when it comes to food, sexual behavior, cleanliness. Those are the kinds of outgroups that are especially prone to being influenced by the emotion of disgust. And so there are ways
I like that theory, but one thing which is interesting is it moves us away from the starting point, where we start off by saying disgust as an emotion for food isn't this weird puzzle that connects to morality and politics. But this third option makes you want to rethink the evolutionary claim, which is if disgust has also evolved for disease avoidance, then maybe its extension to outgroups and to sexuality and so on isn't a sort of accidental byproduct, but rather is what it's for. And so the idea we get grossed out by strange sexual practices, which put us in sexual contact with people, or by outgroups, by foreigners, by people of different races and different groups, that these are prominent disgust elicitors, might actually just reflect how the system has evolved.
Yeah, I think that I'm closer now to that view. Although, let's talk a little bit about whether it's an appropriate judgment still, because even on this view, I think that it's not so clear that we ought to be using disgust to make these judgments. But I think that it is part of this disease avoidance mechanism. It may have originally started as avoiding oral contamination, but now it really seems part of just in general sort of disease avoidance. And I think that plausibly accounts for these findings. But the extension to the moral domain, I think, is still puzzling. So, and you and I have actually argued about this. There are plenty of things that I find disgusting that I avoid because they're potentially disease, carriers of disease, but that I don't make a moral judgment about. People who pick their nose gross me out, but I don't find nose picking to be morally objectionable.
Or you change a kid's diapers. Right. And you could be grossed out, but you don't blame the kid. You don't think it's an evil kid for booing so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I like this disease avoidance story because it explains some other findings that don't really make sense from the metaphor model. So So Mark Schaller at UBC has shown that reminding people of that disease abounds. So there's a great set of studies where they show, I show you a PowerPoint slide presentation that about germs lurking in everyday places. So, you zoom in on the sponge in the kitchen and you show that it's just like germs are just growing there. And it freaks people out, right? But it freaks people out in a particular way because the control group is freaking people out about the possibility that they're at risk from car accidents or everyday workplace accidents. So in both cases, you have a threat, right? That something bad might happen to you. But in the disease condition, people get xenophobic. And I don't know that disgust is what's at work. I think it's just in general this disease avoidance system that's at work. In addition, in some studies that I did with Eric Helzer at Cornell, if you just remind people that the swine flu is going around and they ought to wash their hands, or we just, in some experiments, we just tell them, hey, fill out this questionnaire next to the hand sanitizer. There we show similar effects. So people become more politically conservative and morally conservative, especially in the sexual domain. If it were simply a conceptual prime, in this case, cleanliness is being primed.
Yeah.
And the metaphor account, unless you're going to say, oh, well, the cleanliness and dirtiness prime these judgments, then I think that's just an account that you can't falsify. But the disease avoidance. So you and I have disagreed about this, and your view was something like, if I recall correctly, maybe I am making a moral judgment when my kid poops his diaper. It's just below threshold?
Yeah, I guess the sort of theory I'm inclined to for psychology in general is sort of what Danny Kahneman describes as system 1 versus system 2. So I think a lot of what we're talking about is a low level, is a sort of intuitive common sense system that is always in play and always active. And it might be that there's an always active connection between disgust and wrongness.
Right.
And then you have a sort of higher level conscious deliberative system that overrides it. And sometimes it overrides it so quickly that you don't even know you had this instinctive judgment in the first place. But my bet is that if you use fairly subtle measures, you would find that disgust leads to moral disapproval, even in cases where it really shouldn't. I mean, the case of somebody picking their nose is complicated because it's disgusting. They are either intentionally or carelessly offending others by disgusting others, so they're morally wrong in that way.
Right.
If someone tries to upset me, so. But the baby is a harder case where it's not obvious that you're really mad at the kid, but it's an empirical question, and I'm open to it going either way.
Yeah, no, that's true. It is a possibility, and in fact, this is a question that I get commonly, which is, conservatives tend to as we've said, they show these effects that they're more easily disgusted, but in our actual disgust manipulations, it's independent of political orientation, so we can show, using subtle measures that both liberals and conservatives are influenced by their disgust response. And so people ask, is it that liberals are feeling the same amount of disgust, they're just correcting for it? Or is it that they're just not feeling as disgusted by, say, gay sex? And I don't know that there's any evidence to conclusively argue for one or the other. I suspect that it's more like everybody's kind of disgusted by it, but just like I say, you were picking your nose, that's gross, but you're not a bad person. That liberals say this for gay sex, and conservatives, many conservatives at least, don't. They don't correct for it. So it's not that they're taking an additional step and concluding the moral thing. It's that liberals are taking the additional step and removing the moral thing.
I mean, there's some good questions here. We should underscore a couple of things. I once spent a whole semester wrestling with the question of why people think having sex with chickens is wrong, and it's not.
If only they tried it.
It's not. There we go. I think the scope of sexual things that we are prone to find disgusting actually is very large. It's more the things that we don't find disgusting is the exceptional class.
I think you're right.
I think
it's like food.
It's like food, exactly. You go nuts trying to list all the foods that are disgusting, just like all the sex acts that are disgusting. It's basically for sex, the sex you yourself don't want to have, don't like, has the risk of being disgusting. The foods you don't want to eat, that don't elicit hunger and desire, are going to be disgusting. I mean, going back to the liberal and conservative issue, one thing which you and I haven't talked about here, and maybe people are going to get confused about, is we make it explicit. Neither you nor I believe that disgust is in fact a good guide to morality. We've both written arguments against this, following people like Martha Nussbaum, for instance, who argues over a series of books that disgust is a terrible guide for morality.
Right.
This is, in this way, if maybe not in many other ways, in this way you and I are very classical liberals. So a lot of conservatives not only perhaps are more disgust sensitive and rely more on disgust and moral judgment, but they explicitly believe that disgust has some sort of moral reliability.
Right.
Leon Katz is always quoted on this.
Exactly, yeah. And what was the name of that? You know, it's a fabulous essay. I mean, just in terms of writing.
The Wisdom of Repugnance in the New Republic, many years. A wonderful, strongly written, smart essay, where Cass is wise enough to know, look, disgust has led us astray sometimes. So the Nazis were disgusted by the Jews. People used to be disgusted at interracial marriage. So it's hardly a perfect guide. Right. And he acknowledges that. But he says, look, there's a wisdom to it that we are being unreasonable when we dismiss it. So his target would be something like gay marriage, say. So liberals like you and I guess, I'll speak for myself, say, totally fine, no one's hurt, think in terms of rights and maybe consequences, but disgust shouldn't enter into it. Cass says the sort of revulsion that some people feel towards sex they don't want to have tells us something interesting.
Yeah.
And maybe we should take it seriously.
And you know, I had a surprising debate with a philosopher friend of mine, Tamler Summers, who argued something similar. In this case, though, what he said was, well, look, if I find a child rapist to be utterly disgusting, what's wrong with that disgust energizing my moral judgment? Shouldn't we encourage that kind of negative reaction toward people who are moral? And where we deferred was, I said, you know, I personally think that there's enough to stand on to make a pretty severe moral judgment without involving disgust. I don't think I would lose any of my negativity toward child rapists.
Right. So here's an analogy using that case. Suppose I find a child rapist and he's black and I'm a racist. And I say, well, what's wrong with my racism energizing my anger at him? Well, what's wrong with it is that's a superfluous aspect of things. That the color of his skin has nothing to do with it.
Right.
It just so happens by accident my racism has got it right this time.
Exactly. The danger of it leading you astray in another important domain is worth, I think, giving a real close look at the influence of disgust.
I mean, I would sign on. I'll ask you what you think. I'd sign on to the view that Nussbaum presents that disgust should play absolutely no role in policy, in morality, in we should recognize it as an irrational consideration and try our best to suppress it.
I absolutely believe that. I used to not, Paul, I used to just end my talks before getting to this point.
Yeah.
But it's something that people want to talk about. And so now I say, well, look, I'm a scientist. I'm not a philosopher. But here's a case where I think the evidence can really inform the ethical question. If I can show how spurious the disgust emotion is and how easily it can influence, isn't that grounds to at least question whether or not you should be allowing disgust in any particular case to influence your judgment? If we were smart enough to say, look, on absolutely normative, rational, ethical grounds, I hate child molesters and I'm disgusted by them. And so I'm going to let the disgust take its course here, but I'm not going to in the case where it's a racist disgust. Then that would be great. I just don't trust human beings to do that. So if we could eliminate disgust from social judgment in general, I think I'd be fine with it. But I want to save it for physical disease.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a broader point that this speaks to, which is the relationship between psychology and morality. There's Sam Harris famously thinks you could reduce moral questions to scientific questions, and I'm unsympathetic to that. But where I think it's true is that scientific inquiry can tell us something about the reliability of our moral intuition. So just like scientific study could say, look, part of our probabilistic reasoning is mistaken. We tend to get probabilities wrong, getting views, so we just shouldn't reason that way. We're making mistakes. We could also, in some cases, say, look, we have moral feelings based on this emotion, but upon close scrutiny, using sort of our reflective capacities to look for inconsistencies and irrationalities, this emotion's unreliable. And psychology, I think psychology and evolutionary theory can't directly answer moral questions. It's not going to say, what's the best tax policy, or is gay marriage right or wrong, or whatever. But it can tell us something about our moral faculties, and that in turn can inform our moral decisions.
Yeah. So the trick is, in the moral domain, you made the I think the right analogy to the domain of probabilistic reasoning. And as much as there might be debate about the right answer when it comes to statistics and probability, there is far more disagreement in the moral domain. And so it becomes a little trickier to have, to use jargon, an error. What's the error here that's being made? So you can do a study and show that people commit, the conjunction fallacy, right? The classic demonstration in judgment decision making. Linda is a bank teller. Linda is a feminist. Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. The probability that one of the first two is true is much greater than that both of them are true. And so you can take that piece of paper, show it to people, and say, "Do you see what you did here?" And they say, "Oh." Right?
Yeah.
I see what I did. But it's hard to do. There's no real, sometimes there might be a way to do this in the moral domain. But one way you can't do it is to take the conservative and say, "Oh no, see, you're just disgusted by gay sex." And they don't go, they don't say, "Oh, I see." Now I know. So, I mean, one strategy you can use is show people that they're inconsistent, right? You can show that, hey, look, the font that I used made you think that gay marriage is right on this day, and it made you think that it was wrong on this day. And so at least you can point out the inconsistency, and they can say, okay, well, maybe I need to do a better job of this.
And another way, which maybe is also a form of inconsistency, is you could suggest for any moral intuition somebody uses, if you could show them that it's unreliable in cases where they themselves believe it's unreliable, they could distrust it. So you say to somebody who is your hypothetical person who's against gay marriage simply because it grosses him out, and then you say, well, look, people used to be grossed out by interracial marriage exactly as you were, and in fact, people who make arguments in favor of gay marriage make the analogy a lot between the debate about interracial marriage. Nobody rational now would be against interracial marriage. So the person who this puts the person arguing for the role of disgust in a bind. They then have to explain why the cases are different. And absent such an explanation, they shouldn't be making the argument they're making.
Right. One of the examples I always give students is, so you can do this. John Haidt has these nice demonstrations that he calls moral dumbfounding, where he pushes people on the moral question until they have to admit. So the classic disgust example is incest, where you remove all of the sort of reasonable barriers to thinking incest is okay, and participants are left with just disgust. They realize that the only reason they seem to think incest is wrong is that it's really gross. So I ask people, think about two really unattractive people having sex. Isn't that gross? Does it? Yeah. Do you think that this should be regulated by the law? Which is a bit of sleight of hand, but it's effective. At least it leads them to question whether or not their judgment should be influenced, or whether it is in fact influenced across the board.
So do your studies of morality and emotion pursuing this argument make you into sort of hardcore consequentialists? Do you think that armed with what we know about the emotions, that this should shape the moral code we have and maybe push us more towards consequentialism?
I'm not willing to go that far. I have a hard time actually being a consequentialist, and I think that there are intuitions that I just don't want to shake, that I realize are hard to ground, but that I haven't found out. I haven't been disabused of them by someone pointing out that they're inconsistent or wrong. And so the example that I think that you give is torturing a baby or a small child in order to prevent something worse from happening.
And to be
I can't shake that.
To be fair, it's not as if the only alternatives in play are a sort of hardcore consequentialism where you add up pleasure and pain, as opposed to living by your gut feelings. So there's a lot of virtue ethics and deontological theory to have abstract moral principles. Say a principle banning the harm of an innocent, no matter what good it would do. And these are arguably grounded themselves in reason and not emotion. Though it's a matter of a lot of debate in psychology. So our friend Josh Green would argue that these so-called, abstract moral principles are themselves nothing more than articulation of gut feelings.
Yeah, I think though that it is one mistake, as you point out, to equate deontological intuitions with sloppy System 1 thinking, and it's less elegant because you have a number of rules that are hard to ground, right? So you might say, well, it's wrong to lie, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to cheat, it's wrong to murder innocents, and now you have to sort of maybe defend why you have these various intuitions. In consequentialism, it's easy. You just have one intuition that you have to ground, and that is that pleasure should be maximized, or whatever version of consequentialism you happen to endorse. Let's define the good. Let's define how to maximize it, and say we ought to act in such ways that maximize the good. You still have to ground that. I mean, that has to get up somehow. And so you can be a very well-reasoned deontologist. It just so happens that many of our gut reactions align better with deontological principles. But it's not like Kant was like some sloppy guy, Of all people to accuse of being ruled by their gut reactions, I don't think Kant is one of them.
Although to be fair, I mean, people like Green argued that he was exactly that kind of sloppy guy. He was just, so he had all these views about sex, masturbation being wrong and so on. And Green says it's just, it's just he's a very, very smart guy who had this gut reaction about certain things and managed to gussy it up in fancy theoretical language. Yeah. I think if any philosophers have made it this far into our discussion, they're like now totally freaking out. That's right. So then on that, let me shift gears a little bit. You're a social psychologist, and your work, a lot of your research is on the influence for non-philosophers, for people, of the emotions on decision-making, for the emotions on moral judgment and moral action. And at some level, this fits into a broader movement that you and I both discussed in social psychology, which is the dismissal of reason, which is arguing that day-to-day life, we're actually really influenced by unconscious priming, implicit cues. I think I'm conservative because of this and that, but actually I'm conservative because I just washed my hands in a pre-oral dispenser. I think I'm being I think I'm voting the way I'm voting because of my logic and arguments, but really it's because there's an American flag in the room. And there's hundreds, maybe thousands of demonstrations now that were pushed and pulled by factors we're unaware of. And a lot of social psychologists, respected top people in the field, would say, this is all we are. We're entirely ruled by gut feelings and emotions. And as John Haidt puts it, our reason, deliberation, our arguments are after-the-fact justifications of things that have already happened. And that's reasoning is basically for explaining after the fact what things happen. And it could look from what we've talked about so far that your work is sympathetic to this approach, but I know you have some thoughts about it.
Yeah, if you were to just take the corpus of social psychological research done in the past, I don't know, would you say 20 years maybe even, you would conclude that people are, we're leaves blowing in the wind. We're just driven by all kinds of things that are completely outside of our control. and we're lucky if we make one rational decision in our lives, because that, there has to be lots of just, gritting of the teeth and sweating, and maybe we can produce a rational decision that overrides all these other influences. I really have tried to resist this view, although I don't know that my work demonstrates this. But there are a couple of problems. One is that nobody really cares if we report a study that people acted in the rational manner. So what happens is that you now have a body of work that is completely over-represents the irrational influences, which would be fine if social psychologists went out of their way to say, take the case of visual perception. You could have a bunch of papers showing interesting visual illusions and the errors that we make based on these visual illusions, but it's an extra thing to conclude that vision therefore is completely flawed. We get around every day, right? And this is how I was introduced to the use of these demonstrations in social psychology. To me, it was very much an analogy with visual perception, where we say, look, we can bring people into the lab and trick them into making these judgments based on, the brightness of the room, or the color of the curtains, or the smell of the experimenter. And these are interesting demonstrations that show how the mind tends to process information and output judgment. But these are very, very stripped down conditions, and conditions in which we on purpose ramp up the influence of these things to show that they actually can happen. And to conclude, as many of my wonderful colleagues have concluded, that now we have amassed a body of evidence showing that we are incapable of reason seems like just the wrong thing to conclude. And I don't even know how they got there, aside from being rewarded for publishing the findings that I myself, for instance, have published.
I agree with you on so many levels. And I could partially answer the question, which is, suppose you're interested in how people assign punishments, like if you're on a mock jury to someone found guilty of a crime. It's interesting from the standpoint of a social psychologist, standpoint of everybody, to find we're influenced by the race of the person, even if we ourselves are not racist, or we're influenced by the temperature of the room, or how much we ate beforehand, or whether there's a flag in the room, or what words we heard a day ago, or whatever. And you can imagine a series of papers published in our top journals that show the subtle influence of these different factors. But and that's fine. But what this misses out on is the huge influence of what we think the person did, and what we think that deserves punishment. In some way, if they said this is so obvious, of course this is 99% of it. But rather, what happens is you have these hundreds of studies, these little influences, and then people say, that's all there is. That's all there's published.
That's all there is, right? Yeah, it's a weird turn that our field took to and maybe this is the fault of the popular press or something, but I think that we need to, as a field, start taking this issue, start treating it a bit more responsibly. And one example that maybe we can build on is evolutionary psychologists have been fighting the good fight for a while. So whenever an evolutionary psychologist publishes something about perhaps men rape because it's been an effective reproductive strategy, they always have to go way out of their way to say, look, we're not saying rape is right, or that it's good, or that anybody should do it, or that it should be excused. And in fact, rapists are horrible, horrible people. All we're saying is that in this particular mathematical model, you introduce some percentage of rapists into the population, and they will persist. And I think that we should be more willing to do something like this when we give popular talks or when we publish in the popular press. And even though we don't, it's very rare to see, hey, we asked people, is 2 + 2, what's 2 + 2, and they said 4. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
There are findings within our own papers. So one of the things that we can point to is, for instance, if I show that the smell of the smell of the room made people find a foreigner, more morally despicable. There are probably a substantial number of people who did not show this effect. Maybe we can highlight this in the discussion. We can also say in the conditions, for instance, in your example of guilt and jury decisions over guilt, we could show that the severity of the crime actually accounts for 85% of the variance in judgment, and that this is a good thing, right? That people who steal $20 are seen as less bad than people who rape children, and that this is. And we don't even talk about those, even in my own papers. In talk, sometimes I highlight this, but in my own papers, I don't say, this is the percentage of people who actually we can demonstrate that they did not commit this error, right?
So Lee Jussum, who's chair of psychology at Rutgers, has a very interesting book out on stereotypes and biases and the psychology of it. And he points out, and this is heretical within social psychology, he points out that there certainly are effects on your perception of somebody based on their skin color and their gender and so on. But these are actually not big effects. They tend to be unreliable. So for every study showing that we're biased in favor of male candidates for a job, you find another study showing no effect, and another study showing you're biased in favor of female candidates. So there's a tremendous reporting bias. The sort of stuff that we get in the top journals are ones that fit a sort of pre-established story. There's subtle effects, and they only apply for strangers, and they get swamped by other effects. So, for instance, Paul Rosen, we were talking about before, we owe such a great debt for his work on Disgust. He's recently made an argument backed up in some work he's doing, saying that, when you see a stranger, their race will affect how you interpret them. But that effect is very small compared to the influence of their clothing. So whether somebody is dressed in a shabby outfit or an elegant three-piece suit will have a huge influence on how you perceive them. That way more than the color of their skin. But the problem is that's rational because it reflects where they come from, what they choose. So psychologists are uninterested in it. I can't resist adding one thing, which is that, people make fun of relativists who say there is no truth and there's no such thing as arguments, yet argue that this is true at great length. And I think some people in psychology fall into the same trap. I don't know what to make of reading, thick books full of perfect, elegant argument and elegant experiments and scientific proof, pushing to the point that we don't care at all about science or arguments or proof. And the only way I can reconcile this is that the people writing these books think, at least tacitly, that there's a tiny population of these elite humans, themselves and the people who are going to read their books, who are capable of appreciating arguments.
And we're speaking to each other only.
And we're speaking to each other only, and the rest of the world kind of grunts around, being pushed around by implicit priming, and whoever's yelling at them the loudest.
It's like we're the X-Men, and we've developed this mutation that 5% of the world's population is capable of making, for instance, having free will and rational argument, and our task is to describe the rest. It's our superpower.
That's our superpower.
I know there is some irony. So there, I do want to distinguish though between. Well, there's a couple of distinctions to make. One is that it's quite possible that, as and this is a controversy that's only going to get even bigger. But there are probably a bunch of findings for a variety of reasons that aren't true, right? So the pressure to publish neat findings has influenced, all the way down to what you say in your lab meetings to your students. And so there might be a variety of these findings showing these subtle influences that just can never be replicated again, because when you do it the right way, it doesn't exist. But let's take those away, and I don't know what percentage of those would be. So then you're left with these real findings that, as you argue, might wash away in the real world. But here's where I'll put on my social psychologist hat and say, well, look, what you said is all true. But let me use an argument that you, in fact, introduced me to, and this is when we were when I was in graduate school, we wrote a critique of Jonathan Haidt's paper, The Rational Dog and Its Emotional Tail, where you and I championed reason. And one of the things that we say in that paper, that if I recall came directly from you, is the frequency. So John Haidt said, we by and large we use our gut to make our moral decisions. And one of the things we argue is, look, if I decide just once that abortion is wrong because I reasoned my way through it and I read all the arguments, that one time is all that it takes to then alter my decisions forever. And if you measure my judgment about abortion from then on, you might find nothing but system one because I've already been convinced of it.
Yeah.
And so the argument here was frequency was not a good metric about the importance of a judgment. And so let me see if this works on you, which is to say that the size of the effect and the fact that it might wash out every once in a while, or even the small temporal nature of the effect, doesn't mean that it can't have a profound influence. So when you say that it's only strangers and it's only clothing overwhelms it, the judgments of people when it comes to race, it still makes a huge difference when it's a cop nervously pointing his gun at a potential suspect. And all you need is 100 milliseconds of being influenced by the black face, and then all of a sudden you think that black wallet he's pulling out is a gun, and you shoot him dead. So importance isn't really there's still a lot of these judgments that, although subtle and although washed out over time, can still have profound effects on our lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with both the points you're raising. So there's a discussion to have maybe for another day, which is debates about the fragility of certain social psych findings and certain psychology findings in general. There's been kind of a brouhaha in our field where a lot of people are arguing, and I think fairly convincingly, that our standards up to now regarding replicability, regarding experimental design, and so on, have not been fully adequate. And that as a result, what happens is people, for instance, will get a cool finding, rush it out to publication, and it might just be due to chance, and it might just be due, they might get away, not intentionally, of course, but you pilot a study over and over and over again, and then it might work, and you say, we got it, this is true, but the problem is if you keep doing it until it works, sooner or later it will work for most things. And I know myself, I hear these criticisms, and I look back on some of my work, and I kind of say, I can do things better. So this is an issue we need to think about. I agree. I think regarding the broader picture of human nature, the view from social psychology can be entirely misleading. But I also agree, if there are subtle effects, they can have a huge difference in real life. If there is a subtle bias, say, against African Americans applying to graduate school or against women faculty members, even if it's statistically small, it could affect millions of people, thousands of people, say. It could affect a lot of people's lives, and it's wrong. And we should know about it, and we should move to stop it. But the interesting aspect of the human mind, it seems to me, is that once we know we have this bias, we can act to respond to it. So if I know, for instance, suppose it's true that the attractiveness of somebody makes me more likely to accept them as a student or as a colleague or something because we like attractive people more. And suppose it's also true, I think that's wrong. I think objectively, rationally, I think we shouldn't do things that way. Well, then I'm smart enough to say, look, when we choose our applicants, don't look at pictures. We don't include pictures. If it turns out I'm biased towards one gender or another when grading papers, well, then we should have a system where I don't get to see the people's names when I grade the papers and so on. And the fact that we could do that seems to me the cool part of human psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that showing the limitations of the human mind's ability, say, to process large chunks of information in a rational manner, is simply to say, well, so how can we avoid potentially damaging both our own lives and the lives of others? And so there's value to it, and we don't need to then preach to the world that we're really dumb. I mean, for God's sakes, we can do calculus.
We can do some of us could do
some
calculus.
of us, yeah, but we could do large sums.
We can add and subtract.
Yeah. And so to conclude that we're completely incapable of this sort of thing is just it's ridiculous, and it's done a disservice. But we also need to clean up our methods. And you and I both talked about this, and at the end of the day, this is what science is about. Somebody's going to come around and say, look, there's this better methodology or this, but, and here's a case where social psychology, ironically, can influence itself. So showing all of the work on motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, these are all things that are at work when we're when we're talking about our own studies, right? When we decide to remove the outlier and moreover think that it's completely justified, but we do that more after we've seen that the result is not in our favor, and it is we don't. A lot of people don't remove outliers when it's in their favor. They justify it the other way. So all of these effects on cognition and the motivated nature of our reasoning have influenced us in such a way that we need to correct for it by institute. What do you do in your lab? Is any of this talk on increasing the rigor of methodology having an influence on the way you actually do your science?
Yeah, I mean, the timing is interesting. In our next lab meeting, we're going to discuss some of the papers that just came out on this. And for me, what it does is I'll give you an example. I'm doing a series of experiments which we piloted it in different ways and it didn't work. And then we got a really cool finding. And but I don't want to tell you the finding because the next thing is we're just going to do it again. We're going to do it again of a different sample of subjects because statistically, I mean, we tried it like 3 or 4 times and we kept improving it. And so statistically, it looks real, but it motivated cognition and bias applies to ourselves. And so we're going to do it again. Yeah. And I would not have done it again before this fervor and everything. And there's a lot of ways in which we're trying to clean up. Right? I think to be optimistic, our field is trying to, as any scientific field does, is trying to reform itself. And you might be right that social psychologists in particular are better able to do this than most people because they understand more than anybody else the influences of wishful thinking and ambition and
if anything, it's given us the conceptual tools to talk about this. I can say, we can say, oh, this is just a case of confirmation bias, and oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I mean, on the other hand, for me, it's given me the tools to see how the people I disagree with are such terrible scientists.
This is always, that's why the corrective influence has to be on the scale of the group.
Yeah, on the scale of the group, because applied to myself, I actually perfectly fine.
Right. When I search my memory, I find that I have in the past committed none of these errors and had flawed methods.
It's just disappointing how biased other people are. So, David, this has been a pleasure talking to you. You are the most rational of all people. And we got to do this again sometime.
I've learned from the best. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Take care. Bye.